Thank you, everybody. Nice to be here tonight in sort of fall weather, but it's certainly turning winter. My name is Dan Pauly, and I've been winter camping in the Boundary Waters for many years, probably for about 30. And I've done it all kinds of ways: traditional gear, your North Face type tent, your hot stove, all different ways. And I've covered it in cross country skis and snowshoes, and all different ways. And so I'm looking forward tonight to sort of talking about some of my experiences and what I have learned over time and what makes the Boundary Waters special. So thank you again for joining us, and hopefully this will be informative. First, I'd like to thank certainly Midwest Mountaineering for hosting the Expo, but also the Friends of the Boundary Waters, who is organizing this presentation. And today is Give to the Max Day, and so if you're in a position to give to the Friends of the Boundary Waters, that would be tremendous. They're working very hard on preventing sulfide mining in northeast Minnesota. Their 2 mines, 1 threat issue is a big one. So we won't, the copper mining industry, I won't go into that now, but if you're able to give today, that'd be great with Give to the Max Day. So the 2 main things I'm going to hit today are going to be, what makes the Boundary Waters incredible in winter, what is really special that you don't really get on a summer trip. And then I'm going to dig into some issues of transportation and shelter. Those are sort of the critical decisions. And then I don't have it flagged here as a bullet point, but talk a little bit about a little bit of other gear, including, your clothing, and then rules as it relates to the winter, which are pretty similar to summer, but there are some nuances there. And so we'll go into all those things, and then there should be time for questions at the end. So, first off, one thing that's tremendous about the winter, the forest, the lakes, everything's going to be totally different in terms of, the snow cover. One thing that's great, even though our winters in Minnesota are generally getting more mild, you still get some great cold winters up in northeast Minnesota, the Boundary Waters, and a lot of snow. So we might have no snow in the southern half of the state, but there can be great snow up there. And, in the winter, you're able to get to areas that you can't get to in the summer. So this is a shot actually from last winter in a trail over to Blue Snow Lake, which is kind of close to Tuscarora. You get into it off of the Gunflint Trail, and you go to Round Lake by Gunflint or by Tuscarora Outfitters. Then you go down towards a couple portages. And this is actually not this is not a regular portage trail. This is a tamarack swamp with, in this picture, some really beautiful hoarfrost that had formed overnight. And there's not a formal portage to that lake, actually. And so there's some seasonal activity sometimes, like this trail we were on. I don't think anybody maybe had been there for maybe years. We talked to the folks over at Tuscarora Lodge, and they said, not that many people go in there in a given, actually many winters no one would go in there actually to Blue Snow Lake. So, that's one thing, because you're not limited to portage trails, you can really get off the beaten path to some really cool places that otherwise you're not going to see. And if you've ever sort of backpacked in the Boundary Waters or hiked outside of the trails, say off the portages, it's really difficult to get around just because the downfalls and the brush. But in the winter, you throw 2 feet of snow in there and you're going to go over the top of everything. And anything that's a bog or wet is going to be frozen generally. And so, you can get around to some pretty neat areas. So that's one thing that I would say is like, it's beautiful with the snow and the icicles you might find here and there. But also, you're going to get into areas that you wouldn't go. Like you can definitely go cross country in ways that you wouldn't have done and can't really easily do in the summer. Here's a couple of shots showing some of that. On the left is some ice formations over by Angleworm Lake, which is off of the Echo Trail. And you can see how there's some icicles formed in the background off of this inclined rock face. And on the right is actually a group of us going into some swamps, some back areas at the end of the Gunflint Trail at Seagull Lake, where there's 3 Mile Island. And, we've crossed over the top of 3 Mile Island in some pretty cool areas that, again, you're not going to be able to see very easily in the summer. And so that's a couple examples of stuff that you're going to be able to do in the winter that you're not going to do in the summer. One of the things besides just the general beauty is I've had probably some of my most interesting animal observations have happened in the winter in the Boundary Waters. And on the left here, you can see a snowshoe hare in its winter coat that I took a number of years ago up there. But even if you don't see the animal, so you might see that, and I've seen moose, I've seen wolf. We'll see a picture of that in a second. And I've seen deer, but even if you don't actually see the animal, you're going to see tracks. And so if you look here on the right, this is actually also close to Angleworm Lake from a couple of years ago, and you'll see a track there. I'm going to let you look at that, and I'll tell you that's probably about 7 or 8 inches across. And just take a look at that and tell me, think in your mind what that might be. Some people will definitely know. So what this is an otter track, okay? And so otters, you do see them sometimes in the summer, certainly, but usually just like a bobbing head from a distance. And around Angleworm Lake, and I've seen this all over the Boundary Waters at different times on winter trips, the river otters that live up in the Boundary Waters will actually sort of sled or slide, because that nice slick fur, they will slide through the snow, and they can cover a lot of distance quite quickly. And you'll see tracks like this, say along the edge of a lake, as I think they're looking for food, or it'll be up and down a hill. So this is something you see quite frequently, and it's just, this is sort of their belly track, and they're kicking with their back feet, maybe a little bit their front paws, and they slide along. And so I've seen this many times. And in fact, a few years ago, I was up on, I think it was Bearskin Lake that time. We saw a track like this. They were coming around a corner, and I said, boy, I think that's otters. And on otter track, and the two people are with, both of which are spending a lot of time in the Boundary Waters, actually, said, no, that's not an otter. That's, one guy thought it was a moose, and the guy thought it was a deer. And it was funny. Sure enough, we came around the corner. The tracks had been pretty fresh, and sort of sitting off on the snow about 100 feet away was the otter. So that was an interesting deal where, we saw the track, and quite unusually, we actually saw the otter, and then he sort of scurried away. This next set of pictures is probably the most interesting thing I've seen in the winter in the Boundary Waters. This is a good number of years ago. Me and a couple of friends were staying up on Seagull Lake, which you might know as being, again, at the end of close to the end of the Gunflint Trail. And it was quite cold. We'd set up our tent, and we were in there getting dinner ready, and we heard some noise outside. And there'd been fresh snow, and snow was pretty deep. And again, it was probably 25 or 30 below. And it was a weird sound, like a goose or something, to be honest. Well, we snuck out of the tent, and about maybe 90 feet, 100 feet away was a wolf, actually 2 wolves and a deer. One of the wolves is here in this picture. This is a video capture. My camera didn't work great, but we do got video, which is actually on YouTube. And so the 2 wolves were there, and they actually jumped back when they saw us. But I think the adrenaline was running so strong in those wolves that we went back into the woods, so they couldn't really see us. We were trying not to disturb them. And then they came back, and they killed the deer actually right there. Then they ran off, and then that night they came back. We didn't go down to the deer because we didn't want to put our scent down there and have them not come back to what they had captured and needed, no doubt. And so that night they came back, and they ate almost, I think it was only 2 wolves, and they ate almost that entire deer, other than like the head and like part of the back. So that was pretty interesting. And they actually hauled the meat back into this little place that we kind of followed a little bit towards that. But what was really fascinating about this, and it's an example of something that's neat when you're up in the winter because of tracks, is I got on the left here a shot of some of the tracks from that next morning we checked out. And they were all fresh because it snowed the day before. And the 2 wolves had pursued that deer in sort of tandem. So one wolf at a time was pursuing the deer, and then the other wolf was kind of lollygagging, waiting. And then when the other wolf tired out, it would chime in, or it would jump in and start chasing the deer, excuse me. And then if the deer tried to get into the woods, which I think would be advantageous for it to get away, one wolf would charge up there, and you could tell from the tracks, and it would herd that deer back onto the lake. And then the other wolf would start pick it up from there. And so they wore that deer out and were able to catch it. So that was fascinating. I've had other times when we went in at Mudrow Lake, which is off of the Echo Trail again, and we went snowshoeing, and there were wolf tracks that we went over, And then we came back like 2 hours later, and the wolves had crossed again. They had gone and crossed our paths after we had crossed their paths. So we didn't see those wolves, but they were there, obviously. And it was pretty interesting to see that and know that we were sharing the wilderness with those wolves. And those are two experiences. You're not going to have that kind of thing in the summer. Another thing that I kind of find interesting about the winter, because you're going into different areas, the trees have lost their branches or the leaves. You're going to see stuff again, like say sometimes there's even human artifacts or relics that you wouldn't otherwise see. And so this is a post on Angleworm Lake, on the kind of on the Angleworm Trail that goes around there, kind of on the southwest side of Angleworm Lake. And this has been up for many years. I mean, I remember seeing this thing like 20 years ago, but it would have predated the Boundary Waters for sure. So this is maybe from the early 70s or the 60s, who knows? And back then they would have marked some of the campsites. And you know, there used to be campsites, not campsite signs, but portage signs, like how long a portage was at the head of each portage. All that stuff got taken down, but there's a few of these things that are left. And I've seen much more of it in the winter than I ever have in the summer. And it sort of takes us back to some of that history that is up in the Boundary Waters. Another thing, like we saw on this same trip to Angleworm, that's a beautiful trail, by the way. If you haven't hiked it in the summer or the winter, it's a nice trail. And it goes around Angleworm Lake. It's probably like a 6 or 7 mile trail. But when we hiked it, there used to be a tower, like a tower for fire tower up there by the Forest Service, and they must have had some sort of telephone line running out there, because they were up in a big old white pine, still in the Boundary Waters itself was one of those big old like blue glass resistors that was still like stuck to a tree, that hadn't fallen off. Anything was old. And that must have been how they strung the lines out, maybe back to Ely. So if there was a fire, they could have reported it. But those are the kind of things you can sometimes see, which otherwise you're never going to get a chance to see in the Boundary Waters. So kind of interesting stuff. And then, you know, the other reason besides, you know, the cool stuff to see, the beautiful stuff, and the wildlife, and the sort of, you know, real relics and stuff, is the challenge, right? So you're up in the winter. This is actually going on Seagull. I go to Seagull quite a bit. And this is a few years ago, and it was negative 40 below. Okay. And so that's where the, you know, Celsius and Fahrenheit match. And so that was kind of cool. I hadn't seen it. We've been up there a couple of times. It was very close to 40, but it was neat to see it quite that cold. All right. Now, what I want to go into next, so sort of hopefully you think, it'd be great to go up in the Boundary Waters in winter. What do I need to know? What do I need to bring? And so I'm going to kind of focus tonight on, you know, how you know, the gear you need in terms of transportation, and then even more time into sort of your shelter, because those are the two things that are going to really vary for most people relative to summer trips. And, you know, I'm going to assume that most people know the basics of, you know, layering of their gear, and, you know, something that's going to stay warm when it's wet and stuff like that. And I don't really talk a lot about footwear, because most people know something that works for them, but I'd be happy to answer questions at the end on that. So I'm going to first talk about transportation. Okay, so you've gotten up to the Boundary Waters, and you're going to think, how do you bring your gear in? Now, a first question is, do you snowshoe or do you ski? And I think you really can do either one. And I've done it both numerous times, but my experience has been, and you know, like I said, everybody is different. I didn't say this at the start here, but like different, you know, there's more than one way to winter camp in the Boundary Waters. I'm just giving you my thoughts. But I found snowshoes to be easiest because they handle hills very well. You can cover good distance, even in pretty deep powder. And one thing is, sometimes like when you're either skiing or snowshoeing, you'll have like ice build up on the bottom of your skis or your snowshoes, especially if there's a big year of snow where the ice is cracked underneath the snow on a lake. You'll get seepage up from the bottom, and then when you snowshoe through that or ski through it, it'll build up on the bottom of your footwear, and it comes off easier from my experience off of snowshoes. But you know, that's one that I think I know people who really prefer the ski approach, especially if they have some sort of backcountry ski. And sometimes people will put skins on them, sort of nylon or other material that allows them to sort of climb the hills and stuff better. But I definitely prefer a snowshoe, and I've used both, traditional, and here's your modern shoes. And I use the modern shoe. They usually give you better grip on a hill, but either, you can go either way for sure on the snowshoes. But that's what I generally use. Will it be snowshoes? Um, Now the question then becomes, what do you do in terms of getting your gear in? The first time that I went in with a friend of mine, we didn't have any experience. We tried to snowshoe and backpack it in. All right. So most of the gear was on our back, which was maybe an obvious error because it's very tiring to trudge through the deep snow. Uh, and since then, I've used various types of sleds. And on the left is still a great way to go in, which is basically just sort of your orange sleds that you can buy at a lot of hardware stores, Fleet Farm, maybe Menards. Uh, that's kind of a classic design that has places to tie your gear off, and then we'll carry our gear in, say, duffel bags usually. Then you tie those on. So those sleds are maybe like $30. It's a pretty inexpensive way to get your gear up to the boundary waters, or get your gear into the wilderness. One thing I wouldn't use is some of those really heavy, sort of wider sleds that are used for ice fishing, in the sense that those are maybe made to be pulled by a snowmobile generally, and so they're just not as efficient, and they're usually a little wider. So, but this type of situation actually works great, and I still have these and use them. One thing in terms of how you attach to it, you'll see in this slide, we've got two ways. These are from trips I've been on. On the left, we're using just a rope and on a harness that kind of goes over your shoulder. And I got that technique from Dwayne Leidick, who started Empire Canvas, and now he has Snow Trekker Tents, and that actually works pretty good. Just a couple of ropes and a strap of some sort, because you can pull very easily. You can move it around your body, and you can kind of lean into it, which works great in terms of like pulling up a hill or what it might be. And then if you're going down a steep hill, you can kind of pull from behind and kind of use those ropes. You can just pull them off your shoulder, use those ropes as kind of a harness or reins, and sort of guide it down a little bit. That works great. That's not very expensive. That's a good technique. Now on the right is a trip with a friend of mine where his gear was a little different. And this is good gear. This is the kind of stuff you'll see people, go across Antarctica on. And so he has a pulk, which is made just for winter camping or outdoor, winter sledding and stuff like that, winter explorations. And then that has a waist belt and then two fiberglass poles that come off of it. And those, that's really a classic design. I mean, a lot of people use those. And you can rent that pulk at a number of places, something like that. Otherwise, I don't know their exact price, maybe like $1,000, more expensive than you might think. And then that connects to the waist, and that's a nice technique too. All right, so a lot of people use that. It works particularly well on flat ground, or on lake surfaces, because if you're going down a hill and that's behind you, that's going to kind of push you, which can be a little bit of a problem. But you can unharness, come from behind with it. There's different ways, but that's a nice technique too. That's going to be a little more expensive, but you can rent those. Okay, but then on the right is another technique, sort of in between the two. This is a Black River, I think it's Black River sled, which is made by a gentleman who used to live in Wisconsin, but I actually think he's in the process of moving to Montana, but his business is intact. And this is using a design with a high density plastic that slides really well. This is pretty narrow, a little narrower than those orange sleds. The one you're looking at here is 9 feet long. And then you again use canvas bags typically, and you strap them onto this. And this is going to be a pretty low friction technique, right? So you can put a lot of weight on that. You could easily have 150, 200 pounds of that and pull that, depending, relatively easily. And so that's a design that's been around. This is a toboggan design that's, the Inuit and others had these types of stands for many years. So this is a sort of a timeless design that works very well, and it's been adapted with new materials. And, you can get those. I'm going to give you some prices as we talk about this stuff, because I think people are interested in that and knowing, like, wait, what does this cost? I think a combination with all the straps here might be about $500. for something like that. So it's still not that inexpensive. Without all the straps, you can probably get it and then retrofit it yourself for maybe $250. And that company also sells kind of the kit. So you could buy just the plastic, you could buy the plastic drilled, you could buy, all portions of it if you wanted to get that yourself. Okay, so those are sort of the different ways of getting your gear in. And there's maybe not any right way, and depends on how long you're going in for, but there's a lot of different things that can work in terms of doing that. Now, the next question is, what are you going to do for shelter? And the cheapest, simplest, and actually really quite effective way is to build a quincy. So this is a quincy that's my nephew on the left. We built a few years ago up in the Boundary Waters with my son as well. And if you haven't been in a quincy, I won't give you the overall process and detail, but you end up stacking up the snow, piling it up, and then the energy that goes into the piling the snow melts it just a little bit, and you get this energy of fusion, I think it is called on here, of the snow. And then after say 3 or 4 hours, that stuff will harden up very hard, and you can carve it out and make a really quite strong quincy. This is my nephew standing on top of that on the right. So the next day, that thing's like, you could stand on that no problem. Even after a few hours, it gets pretty hard. So you carve it out, and they make a great place to sleep in. Okay, and there's a lot of nuances to make a very effective quincy, like where the air pockets are and how the air flows, so that you're getting fresh air in, but not letting too much in. And I've been in those at 30 below, and they can be great. In some ways, that's some of your best sleep is in a quincy, because it just seems they'll warm up to close to temperature of freezing, and then they just sort of stay there, dead silent in those things. No breeze, generally, depending if you've made it right, and they can be very nice. And all you need to build that is a shovel, and then some time, right? You want to get in, like if you're going to build a quincy, you're not going to want to get into camp at 5 p.m. You probably don't anyways in the winter. But if you get into camp early in the day, you can make a quincy, because you have to pile the snow and then let it set. But also, you're not going to really probably move around too much if you have a quincy, because of the fact that you have to build a new one in each location. But quincies are great. Google it; you'll see some of the nuances of how to build something like that. Now, the two main things I'm going to talk about a little bit here in terms of tents are actually what are called hot tents. Okay, and so this, on some level, hot tents have been around forever, but I think they've kind of become more popular the last 10 years, in particular in Boundary Waters, and certainly the last 20. And so the first one I have here, this is a tent I have that's called the Red Cliff by Seek Outside. You can actually rent something like this, I think, from a few places. I'm going to give you some names at the end. And this is a Nylon tent, right? So it's not much different than the tents you'd be buying at Midwest Mountaineering, the Rainfly, if you will. And this is a teepee style where there's a center pole. In this picture, this is just when it kind of was being set up. You see there's a stove in there that I'm going to talk about. And then there's a center pole. And then around the perimeter, you stake that out. Usually you're like tying off the branches and stuff. You can try to drive a stake in, but that's sometimes difficult in the winter, right? I mean, for obvious reasons. And then you can't even get those things out. Sometimes people will use like a masonry nail, things like that. But again, it's hard to get those things out. And so I prefer not to do that. But you can tie off the branches. And also you can make what is sometimes called a dead man, where you'd say cross a couple sticks, bury those in the snow. Once that sets a little bit, tie after that. That's not going to go anywhere. So this tent and the next tent I'm going to show you, again, they're called hot tents because you have a source of heat in them. And what we're looking at here is really a very ultralight setup. So the tent, which we just talked about, probably can easily sleep 4. That's about the max in the winter, I would say, comfortably. But that tent is going to be, I just looked it up, that's about 5 pounds actually with the pole. So that's very lightweight. And that stove is a titanium stove that is that you can that you take apart. That it if you see at the top, there's some bolts that allows that thing to be taken apart into 6 different sheets. Essentially, the whole stovepipe actually is one long sheet of titanium that you take apart, and you can roll it up, and then the whole thing fits into like a little pack that it's about 10 by 12 inches, maybe 8 inches, 6 inches tall. And that only weighs like 3.5 pounds. So the combination of that tent and that stove is really only about 9 pounds. And now you're probably going to step in the ground and stuff like that. But you're talking not much more weight than what you'd have in some winter or summer tents with pretty good space. And actually, this tent you could definitely, I've used it in the very early spring, and it's nice to use in the spring. Now that stove it is excellent, but it's not going to kick out the heat we're going to see in some other like the next tent that I'm going to talk about. But you can get that tent quite warm, and you're going to be quite comfortable in it. One downside of this tent or this type of tent with the synthetic walls is you end up often having a little bit of moisture building up in there. Okay, and so if it's not really cold, you'll just have condensation that might run down the sides, or it might drip on you a little bit, or it'll freeze up into frost, which can kind of break off if the wind is blowing. So you get like little flakes of frost coming down on you, maybe when you're trying to sleep. So that's a disadvantage of this design, especially if there's a vent at the top, if the vent's not open so well, right? But one thing you can buy for this tent, the Seek Outside, is you can get, like, they have these liners that would go around the interior and create a pocket. It's just like a white, very thin nylon sheet that ties around. I have that, but not in this picture. And so that creates a couple of things that gives you two benefits. Number one, you end up with being warmer because you've got this insulating wall. And then two, you get less of that condensation. So that can be a benefit as well. This is a design that generally, if I'm using it, I'm not keeping it burning all night. In part because that stove, because it's like, it comes apart, it is going to be not as tight. And so there's going to have some ventilation issue or some air gaps. So it'll burn the wood relatively quickly compared to a non-collapsible stove. But if you're looking ultralight, this is a really nice way to go. And it's actually pretty fast to set up. And you could cover a lot of miles and put up your tent in 20 minutes and take it down the next morning in 20 minutes. And by the way, we always cook. Most people winter camp in the Boundary Waters in a hot tent situation. They'll cook right on the stove, right? You can boil water on that. You can have a little frying pan. Anything you want to do, you can cook right on top of that. Now, the alternative, there's more than one alternative, but probably the other major alternative, if you want a hot tent, is one of the canvas tents. Okay, and so this is a tent by Empire. It used to be Empire Canvas. Now it's called Snow Trekker Tents. And so this is, I think, the base camp. This is off their website. I have one of their tents, but this is not my picture. And so what the benefit of this design is, they have first of all, materials are going to be canvas, and that's going to be breathable. And so there's never an issue in something like that I've had where there's a lot of moisture inside. And now it's really pretty much exclusively, I consider that a winter tent, although some people take it up in the spring maybe. But we'll hang our gear in there and it'll get very dry. Moisture issues are not a problem with a tent like this, unlike, say, the synthetic tents. Now, the disadvantage of a tent like this is then it weighs more. Okay, and so I'll show you the inside of one, or this is actually outside of the tent. So you can see in this is my tent, and actually this is my older tent. I have a newer one of these too. If you look here, the new design in the front has a zipper, which is kind of easier to get into and out of. But when the first models came out, Empire Canvas, now Snow Trekker, made it more or less with a teepee door that would swing open, which works pretty good too, but not quite as airtight. So we're talking about weight a little bit. That Seek Outside, I was just pointing out, that was the Red Cliff, and that weighs less than 9 pounds. The Snow Trekker, which is what we have here, they have a bunch of models, but I have the base camp, and it varies a little bit probably by tent, but also by model. But that's about 30 pounds, maybe 31 pounds for the tent. And the stove, there's two kinds of stoves that you can get. You can either get a titanium stove, which is made by Four Dog Stove Company. That's probably the main one making those. It's a Minnesota company, which maybe is going to weigh like 12 pounds. Or, you can get a stove from Snow Trekker or other companies, including Four Dog Stove, that is going to probably weigh about twice that, maybe about 25 pounds. So this tent we're looking at here, easily going to sleep 5 people, and you're probably talking about maybe 50 pounds. And one thing to note too, this tent, so 50 pounds divided by 5 people, if you spread the gear out, not that big a deal. But if one thing to note is this tent, like around the base, the canvas areas and stuff, they will sort of get snow and ice attached to them. And so that thing, when you pull it out, might weigh, another 10 or 15 pounds, and it's certainly going to be a little bigger when you're moving it around. And so it's a little heavier in that. It's a lot heavier than the snow tracker, than the Seek outside, but then it's a little bit heavier when you leave as well. Now I'm just going to go back a shot too. So underneath here is it's sort of like a sawhorse design. So this thing also, for the frame, also stands up very well, and in wind and stuff like that. So that's a great design. By the way, my original plan was to show you guys these tents set up. The Friends of the Boundary Waters has office space where we could have done that. But I had some COVID symptoms earlier in the week, and it tested negative, but we didn't want to like mingle and have any risk of spreading any illness. So my original plan was actually have the 2 tents we've been talking about set up and show you those things, but we're going to slides instead because of that issue. So if people have questions on things, you can get them to Vitis Mountaineering, and they'll get them to me on some of those things. So now one thing in terms of like this picture shows, first off, great for kids. Like if you're going up to the Boundary Waters in the winter, hot tenting it, tremendous, right? This is my son, this is quite a few years ago, maybe probably more than 10 years ago. And we went over to Paulson Lake, which is again off the Gunflint Trail, and we went trout fishing. But you can bring blueberries, whatever it is, you can bring just about any kind of food in, because it's not going to perish. And even like say a salad, like even if it's 20 below, you put it in the tent. Once you get there, that stuff doesn't really freeze. So you can cook just about anything on that stove. And then you'll also see he has on nice little booties, like sort of a down type boot that we kind of use in the tent. And he's sitting on a little, that's a Lafuma pop-up chair. Now there's a bunch of other companies that make nice little lightweight chairs. But you can bring those things along on a winter trip, and it's really not that burdensome compared to, say, in the summer. And I'll say a couple of reasons why the issue is not so burdensome. One is, you strap your stuff onto the sled, and then it doesn't go anywhere until you get to camp. Okay, so you can have a chair like that, unlike say when you're going, and you can be going over like 10 portages, right? And it's no big deal because you just carry it over. Where when you're summer camping, if you had extra packs and stuff like that, you're pulling that stuff in, you're pulling it out of your canoe, you're carrying it, reloading it, stuff like that. So you can carry a little bit of extra gear, and it's not that challenging. And per person, you can carry significantly more gear than you could have in the winter, or excuse me, in the summer, just because you're the weight, like say having an 80-pound pack, not that difficult going over most portages. The other thing you'll see in this picture is this is actually from the Snow Tracker Tent folks. They sell like a ground cloth. So we typically will have a ground cloth down there and set up more or less of a base camp. Although some people like to move every day, you don't have to necessarily have a tarp down there, but it makes it for like really almost like a cabin in the woods. It's a great way to see the Boundary Waters. Here he is. This is just another shot of inside sleeping at night. We tend to have a fire going through the night. Someone stokes it every couple of hours, but because that it often won't get quite as cold, certainly as if you didn't have any heat. But he still has a pretty warm marmot mummy that he was sleeping in. Now, sometimes people say, well, how warm does it get? And our experience has been like in a snow tracker type tent. I have found it's going to vary, but I have found generally it's about 7. You can get it relatively easily up to about 70 degrees warmer than what it is outside. Okay, so it's 40 below. Keeping that tent 30 is not that. That's working hard to get it at 30 maybe, but that feels like heaven compared to 40 below, right? And say more traditionally, like if you're out there at 0, you could be having that stove kicking off enough heat so it's 70 degrees during like while you're cooking dinner and hanging out. You dry your clothes off. Again, it's like a little cabin in the woods. And relaxing. If you have chairs along, it's nice. Maybe you brought something to drink. And then you go to bed, it's gonna cool down. And maybe at points in the night, it's gonna get to 20 degrees. But if you're dry and you're warm, in your bag, that's not that big a deal. And then someone throws a little wood on the fire and you're cozy again. And that point, which I was raising before about being dry and being able to thaw your stuff out, is really one of the benefits of winter camping with a hot tent, either one of the hot tents, because, and I've done it, just with sort of your North Face type tents, where the day after you get in there and you want to put your boots on, if they had moisture in them, then they're rock solid. And then it takes a lot of energy to loosen that up and get them to be more comfortable. There's things you do to prevent that, like say you can maybe put those, like pull your liners out, put them underneath your bed and stuff like that. But still, like that source of heat is tremendous. The other thing, which you can kind of see from that earlier picture, is you end up getting a much longer day than you would without like a source of heat. Okay. And so we'll hang a couple of LED lanterns in here, lightweight ones, and you can kind of stay up till 10, 11, whatever suits you. Where if it's the middle of January, it's the middle of winter, normally 4 or 5 o'clock, it's dark, you're cold, you're maybe a little wet, you just want to go to bed. And so that's one of the sweet things here. You go in, you hang your stuff up, you hang out, have a good dinner, you're eating it with a nice light on, it's warm. It really makes for a nice experience. So I got a couple more shots, and then I'm just gonna go over some basic rules, and I'm gonna go over some of the questions. But you need a lot of saws and stuff like that on a trip in the winter. A couple recommendations now, and in terms of rules too. So first off, all the rules generally apply in the summer as well as in the winter. The winter rules are the same as the summer, with maybe a couple exceptions. Now, number one, you don't need a reservation for a permit, but you do need a permit. So you're going to self-issue your permit when you go in the winter, right at the entry point. Okay. The rule around 9 people, that still applies, right? So you can't have more than 9 people together anywhere in the winter, just like you can't in the summer. And then you always want to be doing leave no trace camping. And I think probably one of the key issues in that regard is like where you get your firewood. Okay. And, the Forest Service always recommends that you get dead and down wood that's away from your campsite and away from the shore. And those things would still essentially be true in the winter. Okay. And so you don't want to, you certainly would never want to collect it off of Beaver Lodge or Beaver Dam. But also, I think best practice is to also get it from in the woods a little bit, as opposed to, say, taking trees that are partly cut down or fallen over that are right near shore where people are going to see the cut mark. So that's kind of what I like to think about, is you preferably don't leave like cut off branches, if possible, right along the shoreline, so that people in the summer are going to canoe by those, and then they see that human impact. That's my recommendation is to try to avoid leaving those types of marks. And so, but if you go back into the woods a little bit, you can usually find stuff. Preferably it's dead. Maybe it's still sort of hung up on another tree or something. So like once it's in the ground, sometimes that stuff gets wet and it doesn't burn as well. But again, you shouldn't be cutting down trees, and it should be, like I said, dead stuff away from the shore. I have another slide here I put on because this is something that I had never done, but and I haven't done, but people have been to the Boundary Waters in winter have been doing, is hammock camping. And that's not a bad way to go. So this is a friend of mine who was with us on a recent trip, and he set up his hammock, and he has the winter gear, which is quilts and stuff that go on the outside, and he's really loved it. Again, that's not something that I have done, but I think it's becoming more popular. You're staying off the frozen ground. In fact, I know it is quite popular. So that's an alternative to some of the stuff we talked about, or I've talked about already, is to sort of use a hammock. possibly, good combination would be a hammock with that, like that seek outside stove, a seek outside combination. Now, one thing that if you haven't done this, like, what's it going to cost? Like, is it accessible in terms of price and stuff like that? All the stuff I've shown you today, maybe not that toboggan by Black River toboggans, but all that stuff's rentable. Okay, and so Paragus Outfitters in Ely, they rent all that stuff. I don't know if they rent both those types of tents. I think they do, though, to be honest. And then Sawtooth Outfitters, they're in Tofty, right up on Highway 61. And then Stone Harbor Wilderness Supply, which is in Grand Marais, rents it as well. Okay, and generally, like the tent, it varies, but maybe it's like, I kind of think of it like an ultralight canoe rental rate, say approximately $50 a day, and the stove might be $25 a day as well. And then, if you need to rent a sled, they usually have those things available as well, although that's not so expensive compared to some of these other things. And then, you can usually rent winter sleeping bags. I've rented stuff from Midwest before in that regard too. And so some of the stuff is rentable from them. I don't think they rent these winter tents. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But they do rent some of this other stuff, or at least they have in the past. Let me see here. I'm going to get to some questions here in a second. But yeah, so I'm going to just scan through here to see if there's some questions that people might want answered. So here's a good question. Can you touch on safety for keeping the stove going in a hot tent while you are sleeping? So actually, the safety thing is an important one. And I think probably the big issue winter camping, which we haven't touched upon, would be like, wow, what's the carbon monoxide situation going to be like, right? Like, could I die of carbon monoxide poisoning? And first off, I would never use a propane heater in one of these tents. And that's going to be your real big safety hazard from a carbon monoxide standpoint. And remember, like, carbon monoxide, invisible, tasteless, cause you to get tired, sleepy, you can die in your sleep with that. So don't bring up one of those, I don't know if they're called little buddy, yellow things. Don't have that in your tent. Like, I really wouldn't bring it up at all. But you might be great for ice fishing if you're in your little shelter during the day, like if that's what your thing is, but like, don't have those things running at night. Okay. And carrying weight, it's just, I don't think they're necessary. And they're dangerous if they're unattended or if you try to go sleep. So that's numero uno. Like, don't have like a fuel, like a propane or butane stove or anything like that in your tent. That's number one. Then number two, we used to always bring like a carbon monoxide detector along, and it always registered 0. All right. And the thing about burning wood, when carbon monoxide forms, it's often because you have enough like inadequate oxygen to fully break down the fuel. So instead of carbon dioxide, which is safe, you only get carbon monoxide, which is deadly. And so the thing is, like, propane will burn without that much oxygen and create the carbon monoxide. Wood won't do that generally. And, wood, that's my understanding. If there's not enough oxygen to burn, it just won't burn. You just don't get much of that carbon monoxide. The other thing is, they're very well vented. So the tents are, and so we haven't had a problem. Now, the question would be, could you have a fire start in the middle of the night? And I think that's a reasonable question. So we keep stuff, we keep a pretty good perimeter around that stove where nothing would burn. But then we still do have it burn at night. And we've not really had a problem. But yeah, I think it does require being alert. Let me see here. Oh no, here's a good question. And there's so many, probably, I won't get to all the questions. I'll probably go another 10 minutes, depending on how many questions we have. Pros and cons of using a lightweight cot in the winter. Great question. And so what I usually sleep on is actually a Xped down mattress. Those things are great. And you can rent those too, actually, although I don't know, they may not want you taking it in the winter. But so those are great, because the big thing is you lose your heat from the bottom. But I also have, actually, I don't know if it's Xped, but there's a couple, and you can rent these from some places. There's some very, very nice cots, some of which are quite lightweight now. And I have one of those that I started to sometimes take in the summer, in fact. Those are great. And in fact, I would still probably use, when I've done it, generally, I will put a thin sleeping pad over the top of that. Okay. But actually, a cot works pretty good. What we tend to do is whoever's stoking the fire sleeps in the cot because it allows them to sort of sleep in a good place. But I've kind of used like 5 or 6 different cots over the years, and they were great. You know, it's a weight trade off, but some of the new ones are pretty light. So do you have videos of your trip posted on YouTube is a question. The only video I have is that wolf thing. And I didn't put a link on it because it's like very bad cinematography. But if you search Boundary Waters wolf deer, I think it is, like that should find it. It's from like 15 years ago. And you'll see that video. You could find that. Otherwise, I don't have videos on the winter camping. That would be something that would be fun to do. But if you do look at that video, just remember, like, I'm not a National Geographic photographer. And it all happened like suddenly at like 25 below. So here, can you share your preferred air pad sleep bag that you use in shelter options? So I think I told or said I like the X-Ped, the down mats. Those are really great. But you know, there's a lot that are good. And then sleeping bag, I use a mummy bag. I think the technology is really evolving, but I actually still have, because I've gotten from years ago, down bags that have been great. You know, so that's that. Let me see. Any advice on circumventing an error? Oh, that's a question. So here's one more question. What is the biggest mistakes that first timers make? Okay, that's a good one. So, you know, number one, despite the fact they said you can bring quite a bit of gear along, that's not a, you know, license to bring everything in your, you know, garage. And I went into it was actually the Paulson Lake again from a different side through Brant Lake a few years ago. And the 2 guys who came with had like so much stuff. And when they got there, I mean, they had like quilts and just you name it, like really heavy stuff. And maybe that was probably partly on us for not giving them a nice ideas, recommendations, but they had so much stuff. And we all then had to haul that stuff in, and they just wore out. Like they were just worn out at the end of that trip. And I was like, my friend and I were on that trip. We were like 10 or 15 years younger, older than these guys, and they just couldn't keep up. I mean, it was fine, but too much gear it still can be an issue. And then, you know, just not having things that are going to be warm when they're wet, right? So the old story that cotton is rotten. I know many people probably understand that here in this crowd, but you know, synthetics and wools that are going to, like, you know, wick moisture away and stay warm when they're wet is important. And then, you know, we didn't do a lot on footwear, but another mistake I would see, and I've seen this on like people who've come up, they'll go to say a camping store, not that it was mountaineering probably because they would get better advice there, but they'll come away with, you know, these boots that have a little thin-slate liner and they're supposedly warm to like 20 below. And I'm like, that thing can't be warm at truly 20 below if you're staying around. And then their feet get cold. Like you have to have warm footwear. And ideally, it's footwear that has removable liners. So you can pull that stuff apart, hang it by the stove, dries out. And I kind of think the same through with gloves. In an ideal world, like, you know, you want to have mittens, but I have mittens that like are removable, like the liner's removable. That would be another thing that I think first timers might like. I mean, you know, not that you have to buy those, but then have 2 sets of mittens along. But the footwear, go a little too warm on the footwear, and don't assume just because something has a 20-degree rating. If it looks like a hiking boot that's just a little thicker, I wouldn't recommend it. So let me see if there's any other fresh questions. Would lugging a small tracked dog sled work for pulling gear, or would there be concern with the tracks running deep? That's a good question. You know, I would say if you had the dog sled, then I think I would try it. But if not, what I would do is if you go to the Black River, I think it's Black River sled company, who had that one I was just talking about, they actually make both human sleds and then dog sleds. Just ask those guys, or talk to a sled person who does a lot of sled dogs, see what they would say. But I think you want to stay high on the snow at that point, and I would say you wouldn't want the thin sleds, but the thin skis. Oh, now here's another question. I'll make this the last one unless there's another good one that comes up. What's the best time of winter to go? You know, I've had great trips all winter long, right? And so, if you like to fish, then that's going to influence things, right? You're going to be in fishing season. Now, note that there are special regulations within the boundary waters and boundary waters lakes, especially lake trout. So the season is actually longer in some boundary waters lakes. Check the DNR website, but you can fish for lake trout in some lakes longer than you can in other lakes, like outside of the boundary waters. Okay, that'd be one piece. So if you want to trout fish, which is a neat fish to fish for in the winter, that's an important piece. But then I would say, I usually don't go up until near the new year, and because you want to make sure there's good ice. Okay, and the thing about January, it's going to be dark, but you can get some amazing stars. The air is so still sometimes that the stars can be just so amazing. If you're lucky, you'll get to see some northern lights, but you're going to see stars you just don't really usually see. So that's a nice time to go, is January. And February can be great. It's going to gradually warm up. And then we've had some great trips in March. You're not generally fishing in March because I think all the seasons for fishing are over by that time. And so there's like, if you go into a lake that people like to fish, like Seagull we're talking about, or some of the lakes off the Gunflint Trail, like Clearwater, that's Gunflint Trail. Those lakes are kind of fishing lakes. And so, but once the fishing season is over, if you don't want to see people fishing, like you want to have more isolation, then go that time of year, like in March. Although it's warming up, so probably some more people go because it's warming up. But you're going to have deeper snow in March, and you can't actually get too warm in March. Like we've had times where, like, t-shirts walking around the camp because it got so warm. If you get one of those weather times, but January, February, March is great. April, surprisingly, you can go in April, but you got to be careful. It's starting to melt. I mean, sometimes you have snow even in March or May up there, but all those times are good. Well, okay, here's a good question. What type of boots do you recommend? So I'll make this the last question. So what I use, my feet don't really get cold too easily. So I use Sorel with the removable. So I think it's Sorel Caribou. It's got the removable liner wool, and those things have been great. Like I had one pair for 20 some years and they wore out and felt bad about it or regretted it and got a new pair of those. They're great because you can dry them off. Now, I also been up with people who that boot's not going to suffice. And so if your feet are tending to run cold, like the Baffin, I think it's Baffin's the name of it. I'm not sure that's the model, but they make some that are just heavy duty, like, I think special forces type thing, that are really great. And like I have a friend of mine who I know is watching right now has their boots, and his feet usually get cold and they never get cold now. And if your feet do tend to get cold, I bring along some, those foot warmers. But we've actually really never used those. But if you have that as an issue, you could have those along too. So, well, listen, I think we're probably out of time here, but thank you for joining us. It's going to be a long winter. If you need to get socially distant, the boundary waters is going to be really great. Get up there with somebody from your household this winter. You can rent the gear if you don't have it, and come spring, you'll be ready to do some paddling. Thanks again to Midwest Mountaineering for hosting this. And as we mentioned at the start of the day, thing that today's Give Max Day, the Friends of Boundary Waters, I encourage you to check out their website. They've been with the protecting the boundary waters since it was helped create it, and are doing a lot. And today, actually, there's some matching money available to compound your contribution. So have a good night, and thank you for signing in today.